Welcome to the Church Communications Podcast. We want to help you become a church communications expert. We understand it's a challenging and ever-changing role because we've worked in the church too, which is why we built a community of over 30,000 church leaders that are ready to support and cheer you on. Your hosts for the show are Katie Allred, Kenny Jahng, with special guest host from the Church Communications team. They're here to help you and equip you to better reach your community. We'll talk shop with practitioners, professionals, and communications experts about what's working, what's not, and what's next.
Hey there, what's up everybody? My name is Abby McCulley, joining you here today on the Church Communications Podcast. I have a special guest here with me today. His name is Jeff Hook from Communitas. And we're going to be learning a little bit about him, his background, and what they do over at Communitas. So Jeff, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me, Abby.
Yeah, absolutely. So some of our listeners might recognize your name from your previous church software background. We've done some projects with Communitas before, so maybe they have a little bit of familiarity, but I'm just wondering if you could share a little bit of a quick intro for yourself, as well as how Communitas came about.
Sure. My background initially was actually a preacher's son in a little town in Missouri, but then I tried to get out of that small town as quickly as I could. Nothing against the small town, but got into data processing and spent 20 years in business with management consulting firms of Pricewaterhouse and Touche Ross, was a programmer. But then I was approached by my church, Fellowship Church, to take some software that they had built to market, and that was Fellowship One. So we grew that after about 8 years, sold it to Active Network, active.com, went back into industry after a couple of years there, but then came back out and did some consulting for a company called ParishSoft that had half the Catholic market. And both of those companies were sold. And so when my non-compete was up with Ministry Brands, we started Communitas Technologies, which was taking a platform approach to church management instead of just focusing on the weekend, which Fellowship One does, and many of the other products out there focus on the weekend. We focus on what we call the church, which is on the people, and that's 7 days a week. So we do bring the weekend together, but we like to get beyond the weekend. So beyond check-in, beyond giving, into helping people live what I call a more functional Christian life. How can we squeeze that dysfunction out of their lives? I like to say that dysfunction usually comes from sin. And so it's how can we use technology to squeeze the sin out of people's lives so that they live a more full Christian life. John 10:10 is my favorite Bible verse. He came that we might have life and have it abundantly. So.
Well, that's super interesting and also super important to kind of, I think our tendency is to compartmentalize things a little bit. And so especially in this space, bringing some of that together, I think that's amazing. I've heard a little bit from you, from your team, and I'm sure many of our listeners have as well. And so something that we've heard you talk about a lot is how we all live in two different worlds. And so I'm wondering if you could maybe explain a little bit more of what that means, what that looks like for people.
Right. So we're actually living in two worlds right now, right? So we lived in the physical world, but we're also living in a digital world because this whole conversation, this whole podcast is actually brought to fruition because of a digital world. And so if you think about it, we really need to bring the two worlds together into one world. I like to say if I shop at Macy's at a store or shop at Macy's.com, it doesn't matter to Macy's. I'm still shopping at Macy's. And so the church shouldn't care if I come to the physical church or if I actually get discipled through the digital church, because they'll bleed over into each other. And so if you think about technology over the weekends, we can use technology to streamline children's check-in and the security aspect of that, or use technology to streamline giving through online giving. But that does bleed over into the physical world as well. And so if we think about discipleship, one of the things that Chris Davidson always talks about is you can still do discipleship in the digital world But as soon as you then talk to your spouse or talk to a friend about what you learned in that discipleship class, you are now in the physical world once again,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
So how can we bring the two worlds together? But you talk to one of your friends, and if they have their face in their phone, they're not really there with you. They're
Right.
in that
Absolutely.
digital world, right?
Hmm.
Uh, so it is two worlds, but we need to learn how to bring them together.
I definitely agree. And I think even though we've seen a lot of progress for churches in the digital space, I think that there are still a lot of people who are hesitant. Like you said, people who do care. They only want people in person. They kind of neglect the online space, but I think it offers so many opportunities for churches, specifically as data is concerned. And I'm sure that you can speak into that, some of the opportunities that are available for churches.
Right. So you can do some things in the digital world that you can't do as readily in the physical world. So in the physical world, if I'm trying to collect data, somebody has to write it down. Somebody then has to key that into a system. But if in the digital world, some of that information is captured as part of the digital world. And so that information, that data, as you say, differentiates us one from another. And we used to be much more homogeneous society, right? We were
Mm-hmm.
all raised by biological mom and dad. We had a brother, a sister, maybe a dog, a cat, yada, yada, yada. But now
Right.
our society is so diverse. And part of that's coming from immigration, but part of it's just coming from we're living different lives. And so that data about you can personalize that ministry to you. And unfortunately, in the physical world, fortunately, I can see you. I can
Right.
understand a little bit about you. I can pick a lot of information up, nonverbal. But in the digital world, that has to be data driven. And so I have to have that data in your profile so that I can actually provide personalized ministry to you because we're all on unique journeys. We're all at different points along that journey. And if we're really going to help somebody move along that discipleship track, that needs to be based upon, well, where are they? What's their background? What's their demographics? Maybe even their personality style, personality type, and love language, things like that, that are
Mm-hmm.
very uh, personal, if you will. But if you think about churches, they do love language assessments all the time, but it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't go anywhere. They do Enneagrams. They
Mm-hmm.
actually
Yeah.
ask you about your background, but where does that data go so that it can be utilized more in a personalized ministry point of view? Does that make sense, Abby?
It absolutely does. And I think that a lot of times people hear the word data or they think about a software platform and their mind just immediately goes to, cold, hard numbers and just something very like scientific, very calculated. But the way that you're talking about it just makes it seem so much more personal, so much more usable, so much more relational. And so I'm wondering if maybe you have like a specific example of how having better data has helped a specific church meet someone where they are, really served someone, met their needs just basically because you had the data for it, not because you even knew them or knew who they were or had even ever met them before.
Well, let me answer it this way. Um, churches should be very concerned about the quality of marriages within their church, right?
Certainly, yeah.
And so if somebody's a newlywed,
Mm-hmm.
young married, or somebody is soon to be an empty nester,
Mm-hmm.
or somebody is in a blended family because they've been divorced before and they're bringing two different families together. Those are three different kinds of marriages that require three different kinds of marriage classes,
For sure, yeah.
right? Three different kind of ministry, if you will, three different kinds of groups to discuss their problems because a blended family might look at that newlywed family and think, well, we don't have that much in common with them,
Right.
right? Or that newlywed family might look at that blended family and go, oh, I hope we don't have those problems later on,
Right.
right? So they're very specific to where they are. And raising a 2-year-old is very different than raising a teenager,
Mm-hmm.
right? So in the digital world, we can actually segment that, and being part of a church communications group, right?
Mm-hmm.
You love to be able to segment your audience or your community so that you
Absolutely.
can provide more specialty or more specific ministry to them. So is that a good example? Does that give you some clarity on it?
Absolutely, it does. And I think, again, like we were talking about before, it just is giving people a much deeper idea of what data can do and segmentation, what that can do. Ultimately, you're just figuring out how to serve people better. And as you mentioned,
Correct. And let's look at the discipleship track
oh,
too,
absolutely,
right?
yeah.
If you look at the Reveal study, it said that people were leaving the church. The more mature Christians were leaving the church because the church had gotten so seeker sensitive,
Mm-hmm.
right? And
Right.
so, or if somebody first steps into the physical church and we're talking about Christ and what Christ has done, well, in the digital world, I can actually provide some discipleship, for
Mm-hmm.
lack of a better term, to somebody totally lost, somebody who maybe grew up a different religion, who believes in God. And so, again, it's more personalized to where they are on their journey, because that's the number one goal within church, right? Is to help them on that journey, on that spiritual journey, on their life journey, so that they can be more in contact with God, love the Lord, and then love others, right? And
Right.
so,
Mm-hmm.
in learning to love others, I need to learn about myself and why I am certain ways. And so, that whole discipleship track is very much a personalized journey so that we can do the best we can.
Absolutely. I completely agree. And as you mentioned before, a lot of times churches do things like the Enneagram test or the love language test, but maybe they don't do anything with it. So maybe we don't consider that good data. So what would you say is classified as good data? What should we do with that? Where should we put it? How should we integrate that into our ministries?
Well, it should be part of somebody's profile, right?
Right.
And so the profile should be some demographics. And unfortunately, we tend to only do very superficial demographics, but we need to
Right.
start doing more deeper demographics, because in the digital world, if I'm going to present something to you, I want to get something as finite down to who you are as I
Mm-hmm.
can. And then there should be psychographics, and then something we call spiritual graphics, which is just a made up term of what's your religious background? How did you grow up? Have you been church burned before? Things like
Mm-hmm.
that, so
Right.
that the content that's actually provided to you can meet you where you are.
Right. I think that's
Because
super
it
important.
all boils up to your identity. And we
Exactly.
like to
Yeah.
say, yeah, we like to say, your identity is the stories that you tell yourself about yourself.
Oh,
Your true
yeah.
identity, yeah, the true identity is the stories that God tells himself about you. And
Oh,
many
that's
times there's
good.
a disconnect between the stories you're telling yourself about you and the real stories that God is telling him about you. And so the closer we can get those together, then you're going to start seeing yourself as God sees you, which is in that loving manner.
Absolutely. I think that's a super concise way to put it. And I've never heard anyone say it like that, but I love that. And I think more and more, especially within our group, our audience is church communicators, as you mentioned. And they're really starting to recognize the importance of having better data and using that to meet people's needs. And so I'm wondering if maybe you could give us a little bit of guidance as to some ways to open up those conversations within their circles, their staff team, even with their pastors, their church leaders, their elders, whatever that system looks like for them. What are some ways that they can sort of present this and explain the importance of it to maybe people who aren't as familiar with what all these terms and things?
Yeah, so that's a very good question that I think a lot of churches are grappling with,
Mm-hmm.
because they're coming from the point of view of we have a hard time capturing that data anyway.
Right.
People won't fill out the contact card the way we think they ought to fill that contact card out.
Right. Right.
And frankly, that's just step one, right? And that's
Mm-hmm.
step one in the physical world. So when a church has let's say a get to know the pastors, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
A welcome meeting. Well, that's an opportunity to tell people about what the church is all about. It's also an opportunity to collect more data.
Mm-hmm.
When somebody joins a small group, that's an opportunity to do ministry at a more personal level, but it's also a data collection opportunity. So we need to look at the different touch points within somebody's spiritual walk, within someone's life journey, and say, what are some data collection opportunities here that maybe we can have them fill out a form, but even better yet, what if we could have them actually enter that into the system and be responsible for their own spiritual records, if you will, right? The healthcare industry is trying to get us as individuals to be more responsible for our individual health records,
Hmm.
right? So that when we go to doctor to doctor to doctor, hey, we're in control of those health records. Well, by the same token, how can we get the congregation to be more responsible for their spiritual records so that they understand that it's their journey and the church is just part of that? But, I'm an individual, then I'm a family, then I'm a community. So
Right.
how can I actually, because why am I going to church? It's probably because I want to get more connected with God and with myself and with others.
For sure. I think that is certainly very helpful advice. And going even a step further, speaking specifically to our church communicators out there, what role should they play in this whole effort? Is it their job to make those connections with people? Is it their job to train volunteers to make these connections? Should they be the ones overseeing the data? And I know it'll be a little bit different, from church to church, but just in your experience, have you seen this model play out really successfully in any particular way?
Well, I think we're right at the beginning of this journey for most churches, right?
Right.
And
Definitely.
so one of the things that we have to think about is, oh, where has this worked before so many times? Well, this is all
Right.
brand new stuff.
Hmm.
The church being in the digital world is all brand new stuff. And many times churches think of digital church as streaming the Sunday service.
Hmm.
That's just a very, that's superficial when you really think about digital church.
Definitely.
That's again going back to the one size fits all. We're going to give the same message to everybody once a week, and that doesn't necessarily grow disciple makers, does it?
No, not at
It
all.
was starting to fail.
Yeah.
It's been failing, and so let's go back to once I determine what I'll call it my ministry strategy is. Who
Right.
am I serving? Is it a specialty group or is it the general population of a traditional church?
Hmm.
It may be something very specific as I'm going to minister to single moms
Right.
or I'm going to minister to the homeless, right? So the measurements of those ministries may be specific, but if I'm in a more traditional church trying to minister to a group of people, then what should I be measuring, right?
Right.
So, and from a data standpoint, how can I then collect that data?
Right.
And there's a good step along the way called a data audit. How good is my current data?
Hmm.
If my current data isn't any good, then I do need to change my data collection processes, right?
Right.
Because technology doesn't live on its own, it lives
Hmm.
within a set of processes,
Right.
right? And so going back to your communicators is how can I maybe spearhead the education side of how to do church better from a technology standpoint, from a digital standpoint, and grow together so that they can kind of be the church champion
Hmm.
of from a data standpoint. But then the results or the outcomes is where the payoff is. Are people having better marriages? Are people having better family dynamics? Are they having better relationships with their teenagers? Right, and out of that should come success stories, and those success stories are actually encouraging to other parents, to other married couples, to other singles, right? And
Right.
so if I can have more and start measuring the number of success stories, then hopefully word of mouth will cause people to want to be part of that church. And as they become part of the digital church, then they're going to want to become part of that physical church as well over time,
Hmm.
because nobody wants to just live in a purely digital world. Facebook wants us to live maybe in a purely digital world with
Maybe they do.
metaverse,
Right.
but you know, I like to see my kids. I like to see my friends. Of course, if I'm far away from them, I'd rather connect digitally than not connect at all,
Absolutely.
right?
Yeah.
but it's really, I've done happy hour over Zoom,
Mhm.
and it's just not as much fun,
Not quite the same.
as having a glass of wine around the fireplace, with your friends.
Right. It is hard to fully bridge that gap. I think we're making a lot of strides in doing that, but you're right. There's something about that personal connection. And you answered one of my next questions that I've been thinking about is what are some of the opportunities that this good data presents? Because I feel like a lot of people might be thinking like, okay, like I'm collecting this stuff and I'm tracking everything and I'm segmenting and I'm doing everything right. What benefit does that have for me? And as you mentioned, ultimately we're trying to get to better relationships, better marriages, more connected communities. And so I think that's really amazing. Something else
Well, and
that,
then, so let's add it, let's take it to the next level.
yes, please go. Yes.
Once we do this upfront work and we start building a content library
Right.
of long content, which is the church is pretty good at, but some short content and some tidbits that are just coming at you every day as an encouragement around your marriage. Hey, your wife has a love language of this. Have you done something
Yeah.
about that? Right?
Yeah.
Right? Have you spent any quality time with her? As an example, I hate to walk my dog. I hate to walk a dog,
Mhm.
but we have a dog. My wife loves to walk a dog, and her love language is quality time. So I do something that I don't really like to do because it meets her love language. I had to teach myself those things, right?
Right.
But if we're going to teach others about those things, then the system, with some artificial intelligence or some augmented intelligence, I like to call it,
Right.
with some machine learning, can start matching up. So in the end, it's not going to be that much work for the church staff because the system will take over for you, right? So that's what we're trying to do with the platform approach instead of just a database approach
Mhm.
of keeping track of profiles. It's how can we tie then some specific content and some specific groups that may be in your church or maybe beyond your church, right? Because if you only have, let's say, two single moms in your church and you want to minister to them, you may need to connect them to other single moms outside your church. But the church, her local church, is the person that's facilitating that, right? And is helping